All right, so good morning. We're a little bit behind. I had to change cars with my mother, so I forgot my nameplates for you all. And she also has my thing that has my notes and it as to where we stopped. Did all of the groups get a chance to talk about? So we're going to move on to the PowerPoint then on ethics, and then we're a little bit behind. So we were supposed to have an exam today. Obviously, we're not going to do that. Aren't you grateful that we're not going to do that? So what we're going to do is we're going to finish ethics today, and then we're going to talk about purchasing in the consumer behavior and purchasing in sales. And then that will probably be, I don't think I'll get to your selling style. We'll have an exam on Tuesday if I get through all of that. If not, it'll be next Thursday. I apologize for getting a little off schedule, but things happen in life. So I had to be absent that one day. It put me a little bit behind. So then I can combine finding your selling style with preparation for success in selling. So I can combine those two chapters. That will make a nice combination. And so that will actually be covered then on the second exam material, not on the first exam material. And I did pass a roll sheet. So yeah. I'm going to adjust that camera just slightly. All right, so I'm going to adjust this just slightly. So this does pick up all of that. All right. All right. So one of the things that usually emerges when we have these discussions on ethics in selling and ethics in marketing is that students often talk about how ethics is not like mathematics. And the number of you raised this point in the discussion, we talked about it, that it seems different. There don't seem to be proofs necessarily in ethics. And so it seems more subjective. And this is one of the three philosophical challenges to having a fully worked out system of ethics. And these theories or challenges to ethics are not valid theories, but they pop up because people have a tendency to rely on them over and over again, in spite of the fact that they're not valid. And I'll tell you the reasons that they're not valid. But subjectivism is sort of the oldest of these, followed by cultural relativism and then psychological egoism. Two of these do seem correct if we talk about them. You think, yes, that's right. The third doesn't, and it's actually the harder to deal with. The psychological egoist position is actually more difficult to deal with than the other two. So subjectivism is based on this idea of solipsism. Solipsism is a philosophical concept that says the self is all one can really know. We talk about empathy, and one of the things that's important in sales is this idea of being empathetic. And we teach this in the sales rubric, if you look at it, that you utilize empathy to relax the customer and get them to understand why your product or service may benefit them. If they have objections, one of the ways that you can deal with it psychologically is to say, I understand that. We have a lot of people that have expressed that concern as well, and this is what I can tell you that they have found. And so you're saying, I understand, I feel you. But can you ever really know what it is to be somebody else? No, you really can't. And so solipsism says, since the self is all we can know, there are no objective truths, maybe, with regard to things like ethics. So it rejects what we might call a priori knowledge, anything that we can know using the rational mind and separate from and distinct from experience. So this is intuitively appealing. If you go back to 1965 in a case called Griswold versus Connecticut, the state of Connecticut had made it a crime to sell, use, possess, or promote the use of contraceptive devices. So you couldn't have, birth control that was marketed by pharmaceutical companies in the state of Connecticut. Lots of states had these laws that prohibited the use of birth control. And in that case, the Supreme Court says that you have a constitutional right to privacy that allows you and guarantees you the right to engage in family planning practices. Now, at the time, this was really very controversial. And it continues to be controversial to this day. There are companies that don't want to have to offer, under the Affordable Health Care Act, for example, the option for women to engage. Hobby Lobby, which is an Oklahoma City-based company, is one of these that does not want to be forced to pay for birth control for women. Now, why wouldn't they want to do that? Well, a lot of it's based on what's called the potentiality principle. Certain types of birth control, and I'm not a medical doctor, but as I understand that, the traditional form of birth control that's sort of the oldest out there, the pill, in terms of an oral contraceptive, doesn't stop the fertilization of an ovum. It stops the implementation, or the implantation, not implementation, the implantation of an ovum on the uterine wall. And so now they've come up with others that actually stop and prevent the actual fertilization. But the historical, as I understand it, the first sort of birth control, what does that mean? It means that you have a fertilized egg that is then spontaneously aborted by the human body. And there are people that have moral objections to this. The largest group that has probably a big theological objection to this kind of use and sale and promotion of this type of drug has historically been the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church has a prohibition against using any kind of birth control historically, because they think that you need to, follow the biblical commands, and Catholics would be horrified at my simplification of their theology, but go forth and multiply. Well, in 1965, this seemed like a really big thing, and you can still find people who debate this, and we're still debating this issue, whether or not you should use this kind of drug and you should be allowed to market it, or can you force a company to basically tacitly endorse the marketing of this kind of drug by being forced to offer it through their healthcare program. And so if we take issues like this, it seems like we're not going to have any agreement. Now, most people, by and large, on the whole, if we took a poll of Americans today, they support at least a woman's right to use whatever sort of contraception she wants. They may not support a right to an abortion, but most people say, I support women's rights to choose to use oral contraception, right? But there are people that don't. And so can we really have any agreement among individuals with regard to things that are really difficult? Like, should you be allowed to sell? Have drug reps go out and sell this? Should you be allowed to sell abortion services? These are really tough questions. Should you be allowed to sell directly to the consumer any kind of pharmaceutical? We're one of only 2 nations in the world that allows direct-to-consumer advertising of pharmaceutical products. The other is New Zealand. No other country allows that. So how do they market drugs in those other countries if you can't go direct to consumer with consumer advertising and information about those drugs? Well, they rely on traditional selling methods. So you have the drug rep that goes out and meets with doctors and sort of promotes that idea. And the idea is that the doctor will then evaluate you and prescribe what's best for you. We flipped that model on its head in the United States. We have people running to the doctor. They see ads for, happy pills. And they think, oh, I'm depressed. Maybe I need to go get Prozac. And so you have people running to the doctor and basically demanding that they get these drugs. And doctors in the United States, as a result of insurance, this is not true in other nations, only have about 15 minutes to spend with patients. And so if you've got a patient that says, oh, I'm horribly depressed, my dog just died, I think I need Prozac. Okay, here you go. Now, should we do that? I mean, we've got a whole generation of people that are on prescription meds for maybe what are just ordinary things that happen in life. If your mom dies or your dog dies, you're probably going to be sad. And should we be running to the doctor every time we're sad demanding these kinds of pills? So this is intuitively appealing because it seems like we're not going to have much agreement on these issues. But there are things that I think we can know a priori. If we accepted the subjectivist position as legitimate, it would be impossible for us to say, if we said all moral rules are completely up to the individual, it would be impossible for us to form any kind of cohesive society. We can't do that. And the range of human experience is such that I think we can develop and we can see, and you can know these things with the mind's eye. You don't have to experience death to know that you probably don't want to die. Right? If we were completely solipsistic and we accepted that as legitimate, well, I could bring my 357 Magnum, and if you fall asleep in my class, justice is swift. Bam, you're gone. Well, you don't need to experience that to know that you don't want that. A second challenge to philosophical ethics is called cultural relativism, and this one is particularly used by businesses a lot to justify things. Cultural relativists say, now we can't let the individual, we couldn't form societies if we just let every individual decide for him or herself what is right or wrong in all instances. We can't let me decide that I need to engage in swift justice of students who fall asleep in my class by being able to smite you, because if we did that, we would have what was called by Hobbes the state of nature, and this idea of a war of all against all. So cultural relativists say, no, it's not based in the individual, but it is based in the mores of a society, in the laws and regulations of a society. And this leads to a philosophy called legal positivism, which says, and William Rehnquist, who was the immediate past Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, was a legal positivist. He believed that the law was the highest morality. As a result of that, I'll tell you about a case that he argued against, and maybe we'll see what the problem with that is with regard to this idea of it's based in the culture. Now, this again seems intuitively appealing because if we look at societies, they differ greatly in terms of their customs and mores. Again, going back to the pharmaceutical issue, only the United States says that this is protected by First Amendment free speech. Every other country says you can't advertise this stuff. But we have such a strong cultural attachment to the idea that the marketplace of free ideas is where we want to develop the best, that we allow this kind of thing. We don't engage in protectionism of individuals. So we have these people. Now, what's the good side of directed pharmaceutical advertising of product? I think it has brought out of the shadows a lot of issues that before were considered to be taboo. When my father went into the FBI, he went in under J. Edgar Hoover as an agent, he became a special agent in charge. At that point in time, everyone had to meet the director. And if you had ever been seen by a psychiatrist other than the FBI psychiatrist who evaluated you to determine whether or not you were fit to be an agent, if you had ever seen a private psychiatrist or psychologist on your own, you were considered to be not fit for the Bureau, because that indicated that maybe you weren't emotionally stable. Well, that would rule out a whole lot of people in terms of their eligibility today for Bureau service, right? And so I think one of the things that's happened is, as a result of them directly marketing things like Prozac, which is the first big antidepressant to be marketed direct to consumer, we have had these discussions and we have evolved as a people, and we have recognized that these are not necessarily, it's not that you're crazy, or it's not that you're emotionally unstable, it's just that sometimes people need help. And so we've discussed these, and it's no longer a stigma for people to go see a psychiatrist or psychologist and get on these kinds of drugs. So I think that is a benefit. But other societies say, no, we don't want to do that. We want you to go to the doctor and say, I'm not sleeping well, and they can do a whole evaluation. And rather than you self-prescribe, we're going to let the society decide. Appeals to cultural relativism that say things like, well, we shouldn't impose our will on other people. This becomes important in things like the United States and in the marketing and importation of certain products. So, for example, one of the things that we know is that there are prohibitions in the United States. It's called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, against doing things like bribing officials in other countries in order to bring your product to market. If you're an American business, you can't do that. You can't engage in the bribery of foreign officials. Now, a lot of companies argue that as a result of this law, that we're less capable of negotiating really good deals in places like China, where it's sort of expected. And maybe we want to do that because we can get cheaper products brought in if we can negotiate with them. And the United States says no, and other countries don't have that prohibition against bribery. Well, what's wrong with cultural relativism? If we take it to its extreme, the problem with cultural relativism is that it allows for exceptionalism, not in the individual, but in the society. And there are some things that, even though we may disagree on whether or not it is acceptable to engage in direct consumer advertising of pharmaceutical products, there are some things that we say those practices are inherently immoral and you shouldn't do them. And we can see emerging consensus among the world societies. What are those things? Well, you shouldn't engage in slave labor. You shouldn't engage in bribery of elected officials. Most countries are now starting to come around to this idea. But international business cases are replete with these ideas that just never seem to die and hang around and present challenges that we have to deal with. The third one is the one that doesn't sound right. So the other two sound right. If I ask you about marketing of drugs, I bet we would have a lot of different opinions in here. Most people probably think marketing of drugs is okay. Well, what about medical marijuana? That's controversial. It passed in Oklahoma. Medical marijuana by what percent? It was a lot. I was kind of surprised because Oklahoma is a very conservative state. But there's still a significant portion of the population. I believe it was 56% of the vote, which, by the way, in electoral terms, 56% is considered a landslide. If you can get 5 points ahead of your opposition, that's considered a landslide victory. Now, in business, we don't consider 5% to be a landslide. But in electoral politics, particularly on issues in which the population is so enormously divided, that's a pretty big percentage points. But we can, we can disagree about those issues, and you see that those disagreements lead to an attraction to subjectivism and psychological and cultural relativism because they are intuitively appealing. Now, the third one doesn't seem to be intuitively appealing, but it is the one that's more difficult to dispense with. What this one says is that either as a result of nature or nurture, we are programmed to respond to stimuli in very predictable ways. And therefore, free will is illusory. You don't really have free will. You think you have free will, but you don't. Let's try an experiment. Genetically, and geneticists over in the College of Math and Science are going to be horrified by my simplification of stripping down the human genome with regard to gender. The thing that makes a male is a Y chromosome. Females are what? They're double X, males are XY. So everyone who has a Y chromosome, raise your hand. If you have a Y chromosome, raise your hand. Now, why did you do that? You thought you had free will, but you did it. Why did you do it? Well, because we're taught from an early age, maybe socialized, to do what your professor or your teacher tells you to do. You respond to the question. So psychological egoists would say, we do these things and we think we have free will, but we really don't. And this doesn't seem right because you think, well, I could have not raised my hand, but every single one of you raised your hand that were a male in here. For a variety of reasons. You're told to do so. You might be concerned if you didn't. Somebody might look at you funny. But you thought you had free will. I may have tricked you in that question and asking you to do that. And it was an involuntary reflex, which you think, well, okay, that's one example. But with regard to more complex things, surely I have free will. Because I think about things all the time before I buy them. How many of you bought a car? Almost everybody in here should raise their hand if they bought a car at one point in time. It's a horrific experience. And you did what when you bought the car? What did you do when you bought the car?
Like after?
No, before. What did you do in terms of thinking about buying a car? Research. You did research on the car. So you first of all decided sort of what kind of car you need. If you are an individual with 8 family members, you, your spouse, and 6 children, you're probably not looking, maybe I'm wrong, I could be, that's entirely possible, but I would be willing to bet, I'd give you pretty good odds that you're not looking at a Lamborghini. Because how many people will a Lamborghini seat? 2. And you've got how many? 8. So you've already eliminated half. You've eliminated a goodly number of possibilities. But, in theory, you could say, well, I'll let my spouse drive the minivan. I'm going to get me a Lamborghini. Drive that. So you evaluate. If I've got 8 members of my family, probably not going to be driving a Lamborghini. Probably going to be looking at what? Minivans, Suburbans, things that will seat a lot of people. And then what's another what? A bus. What's another consideration that you're going to consider? So now you've limited it down to I've got to have something that will seat a lot of people. Well, how much can I afford? There's a big difference between a Chrysler, what is their minivan now? Is it called a Pacifica, I think? Between a Chrysler Pacifica and a Cadillac Escalade. So you're going to look at your budget. You're going to make these decisions. And you're going to eliminate some. Now, cultural or psychological egoists would say, you think in this process of evaluating that you're making free will choices, but you're really not. You're constrained by A, your needs, and B, what you like. And you can't will yourself to not like what you like. So if you have the money and you can afford it, I would submit to you that most people, even if they have large families, don't want to drive a minivan. That's the reason that the urban assault vehicle is so popular here in Edmond, the land of the shallow and pretentious. And it's the reason that they drive Cadillac Escalades or Lincoln Navigators. It will hold about the same number of people, but it just doesn't have the stigma attached to it that a minivan has. And you didn't will yourself to not want that to be attached with that stigma. What does a minivan scream to you?
Soccer mom.
Soccer mom. And even if you are a soccer mom, maybe you don't want to like scream it from the rafters. And you didn't will yourself to want or not be labeled with that characteristic. So you think you have free will, but you don't. So for example, let's say you go over to the food court because you're hungry. And you think, well, I'm going to eat healthier than Chick-fil-A. I don't understand what the obsession with your generation is with Chick-fil-A. It's so good.
And they're fast.
It's the same thing every time.
It's good chicken.
Efficient, good chicken. You're out of there in like a minute.
Really?
And the customer service.
You really think that Chick-fil-A is better than other chicken?
Yes.
What's other
I
chicken?
mean, like, what are you
Yeah.
comparing it to?
Yeah, I mean,
McDonald's.
okay.
Yeah.
You think it's much better than McDonald's?
Yeah.
Okay. So you all, I'm just always amazed by this because I'm like, it's a dried chicken breast on white bread.
It's pretty juicy.
It's it's completely uninspired. Yeah, I mean, there's just not. I like to cook, and so I try different things. And my family generally gets annoyed with me, and they start saying things like, "No more of that." I got obsessed with making cocoa bun about a year ago, and I made cocoa bun 6 weeks in a row. And my mother said, "No more cocoa bun." So I started making bouillon, which is basically cocoa bun with beef. It's kind of the same recipe. It's chicken. Cocoa bun is chicken with a wine sauce, a red wine sauce. Bouillon is beef with a red wine sauce. And I tried all different. I tried Julia Child's recipe. I tried Ina Garten's recipe. Then I came up with my own recipe. Then I started fried chicken because I thought, well, that's good. And, did chicken fried steak, chicken fried chicken, tried all different kinds of batters that you could make. And it was really good. And my mother said, "No more chicken fried steak. No more chicken fried. That's it. We're done with that. You got it. All right. So no more of that." So you all like Chick-fil-A. But you've decided that Chick-fil-A today is, although you think it is, what is it that your generation says? I know it's no longer the bomb. That's no longer the word that you all use to describe something that you, is it sick? It's what? Okay. All right. I've never heard that one. CLUTCH. Like the part on a car that no longer exists.
No, it's lit.
Oh, okay. All right. So you think that Chick-fil-A is clutch or the bomb or sick or whatever, but you decide that you've got to be healthier, and so you're going to get a salad. Now you thought that was a product of free will because you made a choice based on a rational alternative, but for determinists, they would say, no, you didn't will yourself to want a healthier lifestyle any more than you willed yourself to want Chick-fil-A. You can't really will yourself to not want something. You may want something else more than that. You deny yourself the Chick-fil-A, which you think is just so good, and the chicken is moist and I mean, I still think it's dried chicken on a white bread. I just don't get over that. I can't get over this, but You all insist that this is like really good, and it's like 2 pickles. It's white bread. Like if you want really good white bread chicken, go to Ishins. How many of you get to Ishins?
It's not close though.
Okay, yeah, you can't
You gotta fight for a
Ishins
seat at
with the food
Ishins.
courts. What?
So you gotta fight for a seat at Ishins. You don't have to at Chick-fil-A.
Well, you can always order takeout.
True.
With Uber Eats, I'd be willing to bet you could probably get somebody to go pick it up for you to drive it back.
Yeah, that's understandable.
So, you're gonna eat Chick-fil-A, but you decide you're gonna eat the salad. What a determinist would say, a psychological egoist would say, is that what you wanted more than the Chick-fil-A was some semblance of health. And so you chose a salad, which, by the way, salads are not all that healthy for you, particularly the way we do them in the United States, because what is the number one dressing in places like Oklahoma? Ranch.
So bad.
You gotta drench that salad. If you're having a little bit, maybe if you really wanted to have something healthy, you wouldn't choose iceberg lettuce, first of all, which is what most Americans choose as a salad. Why do they choose the iceberg lettuce? It's crunchy and it has less flavor to it. So you choose something that's really leafy, like a romaine lettuce or spinach or something like that. And you would put a teaspoon of olive oil, some lemon juice, and black pepper on it. And that might be healthy. Drenching your salad in 3,000 calories worth of creamy ranch dressing is probably not as healthy as you think, but you think it is. And you have this health halo effect about it. And so they would say you wanted that more than you wanted the chicken, but you didn't will any more than you willed yourself to want the chicken sandwich. And so you don't really have free will. Well, what's wrong with these challenges to ethics? Well, they're based on emotion. They allow for exceptionalism. You can say, I am unique. My society is unique. I can't help myself as an individual. I'm genetically programmed. My society believes this way. What's the problem with psychological egoism and this idea that you can't help yourself? Well, it confuses and it relies on what's called the fallacy of equivocation. It confuses the reason that you do something, the motivation for doing it, with the results that follow. So, for example, in the example about taking the salad, you may feel good about the choice you made, but that doesn't mean that it's the motivation. And psychological egoists will say that that's what it was. It was what made you feel good. Well, what happens after you choose something is not necessarily the motivation for choosing it. And so it relies on this fallacy of equivocation and allows for exceptionalism in the individual the same way that solipsism allows for it, just based on arbitrary and capricious whims. So they're emotive, they're not rational, and they allow for exceptionalism. What is a valid ethical theory? Well, a valid ethical theory is going to be based on reason, so it's not going to be irrational. It's not going to be emotive. It's not going to allow for your feelings to enter, and it doesn't allow for exceptionalism. Now, that's not to say of these ethical theories that I'll present, there aren't problems with all of them, but these are the things that generally make it valid, is that they are based on reason, they're not emotive as a result of being based on reason, and they don't allow for exceptionalism. You can't claim my group is unique, my society is unique. If we accepted, for example, cultural relativism is true, we could never have said something like Nazi Germany was a priori wrong, and we did. As a world, as a society, as a global, reaction to what happened in Germany during World War II, we started saying that's just not acceptable. The annihilation of an entire race of people is not acceptable. So we don't allow for exceptionalism. So what are the valid theories? Well, the oldest goes back to the first fully worked out system in philosophy can be found. There may have been others before this, but the one that we know about is Plato's Republic. In Plato's Republic, he answers these 3 questions: the question of knowledge, the question of governance, the question of conduct. And he develops an entire system of governance based around those 3 questions. What is it we can know? How can we know it? The teleological approach, which is utilitarian. So this comes from the Greek word telos, which means the ends. And then the deontological approach, which is duty. And then there's virtue ethics. What you see in Republic is you can tease out the foundations, by the way, of communism in Republic. The one that students in colleges of business like the most, because it's the one that seems most intuitive to you, is the teleological or utilitarian approach. What is this? Well, it's what we base our economic system on. The idea is that in an economic system, you maximize your utility. Now, economists are great at coming up with fancy terms for stuff that we all understand intuitively. So what is the maximization of utility? What do you want to do? Since you brought up the fact, as I said, you could have Uber Eats go get you Ishins and bring it to you so that you don't have to travel out there. You said, we're what? We're poor college students who, like I can't afford that. How much is it going to be for Uber Eats to deliver Ishins to me, today? Well, I don't know, probably $50 on top of the cost of the chicken or more. I mean, it could be more than that, depending on how they calculate the cost. And, it's based on a capacity formula, I think, is what Uber uses to determine if there's high volume, it may be cheaper at certain times of the day than others. Dinner time, it's more expensive. So you said, well, I can't afford that. So what do you want to do? Well, since you're poor college students, you want to get the most bang for your buck. So you're not going to go and order Ishin's chicken from Uber Eats. And by the way, I think it's really good when it's hot. How many of you have actually been to Ishin's? Okay, a lot of you have actually been. It's really good when it's hot. Is it good leftover? It's one of those things that it's not nearly as good when it's like a day old. Like I've taken it home before, and it just doesn't have the same appeal the next day that it does. Sort of like Krispy Kreme donuts. If you get a Krispy Kreme donut in the grocery store where it hasn't been made fresh, it's just kind of a donut. But when they're really hot and just been made, they're like crack. They're like so addictive. But if they're you can buy them in Walmart now and places like that. They're not really all that different from any other donut. I don't know what it is about like having that really fresh donut that makes them different, but they're different when they're really, really fresh. And this has become a big thing. There are now all these donut companies that are popping up, these people that are independents that are making great donuts. One of my colleagues brought some to a party the other day, and he got them down on 23rd Street at a new donut place. I think the donut places have now replaced the cupcake companies that were popping up like little mushrooms all over the place. For about 3 or 4 years there, I'd go around the room and I'd ask students why you wanted to take marketing or something like that. And they'd say, well, I want to be an entrepreneur. What do you want to do? I want to own a cupcake shop. How many cupcake shops can we have in Oklahoma City? They just popped up all over the place. And how many are left? Not very many. So as poor college students, you want to maximize your utility. You're going to go over to the food court and eat rather than paying for Uber Eats to come bring you the food. Why? Because it's quick, it's fast, it's location, it's convenient, and you can afford it. Maybe some of you are on meal plans and you can charge it to your meal plan over there. And so you're going to try and stretch that dollar as much as you can to get the most utility out of it. Well, in ethical terms, what we're going to do is not maximize the dollar's utility, but we're going to maximize happiness. So we're going to maximize the greatest happiness. This takes two forms. The original form is called act utilitarianism, which says that in each interaction with other people, I have to decide what is going to be the thing that creates the greatest happiness. So for example, this morning, I did not want to get out of bed. I was tired. I'm normally up at 5 a.m. and I was up at 5 a.m. because it's just sort of when my internal alarm clock goes off. But I could have laid there and just stayed in bed all day. But I didn't. I got dressed and I drug myself down here against my, better inclinations so that I could appear before you alert and chirpy and talk to you about ethics and sales. I can't worry about just my happiness. What would have made me the happiest today? Laying in bed would have made me the happiest. But it wouldn't have made you happy. It probably would have made you happy, at least in the short term. But in the long term, you need some knowledge here that you're going to use to go out and get a job. And so you really need me to come down here and talk to you about this stuff. And ethics is really important because I will tell you that if you aren't perceived as an ethical person in business, I think it has bad consequences for you. Warren Buffett was fond of an adage that was coined by somebody else, but he uses it a lot and he talks about it. They talk about his adherence to it in a book called Snowball. He's fond of the saying that a good reputation is like fine china, expensive and difficult to acquire and easily broken. And so I think that's something that we should think about. So I came down here to impart knowledge, to, as my colleague Dr. Ginchev says, to inflict knowledge. He was a Soviet spy, by the way. Well, actually, he was a Bulgarian spy, but they were part of the Soviet satellites. So, for whatever it's worth. So I'm going to inflict knowledge upon you. And overall, that's going to create the greatest amount of happiness, right? Because you're going to be able to take this knowledge and go out in the world and say, hey, I know something about sales, and by the way, I'm really ethical. Because I had this professor who was really crazy and instilled a lot of ethical values in me. Isn't that wonderful? I can sell your product and I can do it in an ethical way. There's a problem with act utilitarianism in that what may create the greatest happiness in a specific instance, my staying in bed, for example, today, may have created the greatest happiness in this one moment, but not throughout the course of a lifetime. And so in an attempt to deal with this problem of the aggregate, we come up with rule utilitarianism. And I'll give you an extreme example of this. And for an act utilitarian, let's take the hypothetical of the serial killer. There's a serial killer out there, and the cop who's investigating the crimes knows who the serial killer is pretty well. I mean, he's got a really good idea, but all of the evidence against the serial killer is circumstantial. And so he can't arrest the serial killer. According to an act utilitarian, what would he be justified in doing? Well, he'd be justified from an act utilitarian perspective in taking out the serial killer. Because he's going to do what? He's going to stop the murder of innocent people, save resources. Well, most of us say, no, you can't do that. If we have a dystopian world, there's a movie out there that this is about, like the judges are actually the police. They're judge, jury, and executioner right there. It's called Judge Dredd. I believe the original, they've remade this movie. Has anybody seen the remake?
Yeah.
Who stars as Judge Dredd in the remake?
The guy from Star Trek. Not the doctor.
The guy from Star Trek? Okay, the original one I think was Sylvester Stallone. And what happens in this dystopian is that the people become naturally distrustful of the police, and it leads to bad results overall. So we come up with rules that say, in the aggregate, these things work. The police don't act as judge, jury, and executioner. We have a system of government and a system of laws that may not be efficient in the specific instance, but in the aggregate, it tends to work. So in the specific instance, I decide that I'm going to get up and I'm going to come here because that's what my job says I need to do. And although it would create enormous, I'm sure if you'd gotten a message from me on D2L this morning that said, not going to be here, you all would have just been overjoyed in the moment. But by and large, on the whole, in the aggregate, it wouldn't have worked. So the rule says I've got to come down here and I got to do my job. I got to inflict knowledge on you. Well, what's wrong with utilitarianism? This is a link that's no longer live, but it's for the bitter truth. They've taken that down off of CNN's page. I wish they hadn't. It talks about the slave trade in chocolate. And again, I think we talked about this a little bit. We're coming up on the second largest chocolate buying day in the United States. That's Halloween. And a lot of our chocolate is not ethically sourced. And so you can have, in theory, you can have a means justify the ends and things that we just say are creepy. You shouldn't be able to enslave a very small number of people, even though it leads to great happiness. Like the ability to eat chocolate. Chocolate has got all kinds of benefits that they found out about, or they think. One of them is heart healthy. Now, not the kind of chocolate you actually like. It's supposed to help lower cholesterol and do stuff, but you have to get the dark chocolate, not the milk chocolate, which is not real chocolate. But we all like it because it's more sweet and sugar. I don't like the bitter chocolate either. But we could enslave, and we could even do that legally, and we have in the past, but most of us say, like, that's just creepy. No amount of the ends justifying the means can justify slavery. And that is one of the problems with utilitarianism. In response to that, we get an antithetical theory. So if we think about this in terms of the Hegelian dialectic, you start out with utilitarianism. In response to that, you get duty ethics. There are two types of duty ethics. There's religious absolutism. If we're talking about this, well, how are we going to determine what the duties are? We're going to go to the book. We're going to look at what the book says the duties are. So what are the duties? Well, how many commandments are there in the Bible? No, there's a lot more than that. There's a whole lot more if you look at it. If we take just the Old Testament, there's several thousand commandments in the Bible, just in the Old Testament alone. There are the big 10, but what else is a commandment in the Bible? Leviticus 18:20. What does Leviticus 18:20 say? This should come tripping off your tongue. Didn't you all go to Sunday school? If a man lies with a man as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. Their blood shall surely be upon them. What?
That's nothing.
What? Did I?
No, I just said, is that the like homosexual one, not like that line?
Yes. Yeah. It's one of 3 or 4 references to homosexuality that you can find in the Bible. It's actually not found in the Bible. Now, in the first century, Hillel comes up with the golden rule in negative form. I think I told you all this story. Didn't I tell you this story? But it's not actually in the Bible. Do unto others as you would have done unto you. In that it's specific formulation, but I guess you can tease it out of that. Now, of course, there's a problem with that, which is I may want things done to me that you don't want done to you. So the problem with religious absolutism is that whose Bible are we going to use? Are we going to use the Jewish Bible? Well, no, not in this country. The vast majority of people are what? Christian. So we use the Christian. Well, which version are we going to use? Is there a difference between the Catholic Bible and the Protestant Bible? What's the most popular Protestant Bible, probably? Yes.
King James
It's the King James Version. Yeah, I'll give you 5. Be sure to come up and get your points for coming up with that answer. I think it's the King James Version is the most popular. Although now the New International Version is starting to sell because it, does away with all of the really archaic terms and sort of rewrites the Bible in modern. So which one are we going to use? Well, that's not going to work for particularly in a global society. If we go to places like Japan, what is the predominant religion there? Well, it's not Christianity. It's what? Buddhism is the predominant, I believe. If you go to India, what's the dominant religion? Hindu. If you go to Pakistan, what's the dominant religion? It's Islam. Yeah. So I mean, we can't, if we're going to come up with a set of rules, we really can't rely on religious absolutism. So Kant comes up with rational absolutism, and it denies the importance of results. Duties are discerned a priori through the rational mind. Kant says there are 2 types of imperatives. There's a hypothetical imperative, which may or may not have moral import, and a categorical imperative. What's a hypothetical imperative? If you want to get a better job, you should go to college. We know that on the whole, by and large, college graduates earn far more than non-college graduates. So if you want to get a better job, that's a hypothetical imperative. It may not, there's no moral imperative really to earn money. Is there? No. As long as you're taking care of yourself, we don't really think of it as being moral. So, somebody may not want to be a multimillionaire. They may just want to, have a normal job, 8 to 5, not think about it. They don't go to college. Now, there's nothing inherently immoral or moral about that. Categorical imperatives, on the other hand, do have moral import. What's the moral import of a categorical imperative? Well, Kant says that you can discern these by using the rational mind without reference to external experience. So what is a categorical imperative? What's one that you can hold for all places at all times? Well, he says you should always treat another rational being as an end in and of themselves and never as a means to an end. Well, what does this mean if you strip it down? Well, one of the things that it means is that you can never lie. Now, this becomes pretty controversial in business. Never lie? Is it ever acceptable to lie in business? How many of you have seen Pretty Woman? A few of you. There's a scene in Pretty Woman where Richard Gere has to admit that he lied. He's trying to take over this man's company, and he tells the guy in the beginning of the movie that he's trying to take over a shipping company. And he tells the guy says, we'll buy back your stock. And he says, no, you won't. And he says, yes, we will. We have contracts with the United States Navy to make ships. And Richard Gere says, those are done. I've talked to the chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee, and you're not going to get those contracts. And at the end of the movie, when Richard Gere has this epiphany, what happens? He has to admit that that wasn't exactly true. He had delayed the contracts, but they weren't completely dead. So he lied. Is it ever acceptable to lie in business? Cont would say no. Cont would say you have to tell the truth all the time. You can't sort of cite the categorical imperative, never lie. Never lie. Ever? Again, going back to our examples of pharmaceuticals, when you were a kid, you probably got vaccinated in this country. It's required to go to school in most states. And what did the doctor tell you? How did they vaccinate you? Most of the vaccinations. They give you a shot. And what's the doctor tell you? They lie to you, don't they? It's not going to hurt. It hurts. Being stuck with a needle hurts. They lied to you. But if they didn't lie to you, what would happen? You'd be bouncing off. I mean, as the little kid, you'd be climbing the walls trying to get, as they're coming at you with the needle. So never lie? Well, I don't know. That seems too harsh. Never lie. Is it acceptable? I mean, most of us would say for every rule, there have to be exceptions to the rule. So problems with deontological ethics, it allows for no exceptions. And there are times when we would say that lying is okay. If you lie to save somebody's life, that's probably okay. Ultimately, I think the reason that Kant says you can't lie is that if you engage in lying, what ends up happening is that it could lead to bad results overall. We couldn't form society. So in the end, I think Kant would have to be forced to admit that results really do matter. That the reason we can't lie is because we need to build societies that are based on trust. And if we don't, we couldn't do things like market drugs. If you didn't think that you could reasonably rely on the representations made by drug companies, which I'm not sure you should, well, it could lead to bad results. You might not get treatment for things that you need. There is a holistic approach, which is called virtue ethics, and it's promoted by Aristotle in the economic ethics and the Damien ethics, and it's based on this idea of the golden mean. Now, Aristotle doesn't tell us how to act in certain situations. Utilitarian ethics and duty ethics tell us how to act in certain situations, in specific instances. Virtue ethics tries to impart a holistic approach to it. So what is the holistic approach of virtue ethics? Well, Aristotle says what we have to do is we have to decide what are extreme defects of character and then figure out what the mean between them is. So what's, for example, an extreme defect of character? Well, the coward, somebody who is afraid of everything, runs away from every confrontation, is an extreme defect of character. What's the opposite of cowardice? It's not courage, it's heedlessness. What's the middle ground? It's courage. The courageous person knows when to fight another day. What's an extreme defect of character? A compulsive liar. What's the opposite of the compulsive liar? Me, I'm brutally honest. You look like hell in your outfit. Well, that's, what's the middle ground? It's discretion. It's knowing when not to hurt somebody's feelings unnecessarily. You don't have to be brutally honest. You also don't have to lie. Right? So we do this and we come up with virtues. And it's this balance. And so the virtue ethicist would know when it's acceptable to tell the little fib. There are problems with this approach. One is, how do we determine what the purpose of a human being is? That's what Aristotle says we have to do, is we have to decide what the purpose of a human being is. Once we do that, we can figure out the virtues by this balancing act. Even if we determine them, one of the criticisms is, can we instill them? Does anybody think that Ken Lay at Enron would have acted differently if he'd been taught virtue ethics? A lot of people say no, he probably wouldn't. But that's not the point. You don't need the philosopher to tell you what is out there. You actually need them to tell you what is the best that can become. And there's at least one example of somebody who did a sociological experiment on himself and taught himself virtues, Benjamin Franklin. He came up with 13 virtues based on this balancing that Aristotle does. Sort of, these are what Franklin says with the 13 virtues. Why did 13? Well, you can get through 4 complete cycles in a year, because if you multiply 13 by 4, it comes out to 52, and there are 52 weeks in a year. And so he kept track every day, and if he had what were called spots, he knew there was more work to be done on that virtue. But you can get through 4 complete cycles in a year. And he did this sort of balancing act. He rose from very humble beginnings to be a great statesman and inventor, a prolific inventor of things that he never took out patents on, things like the Franklin stove, the lightning rod, bifocals, all Franklin inventions. And he was a great businessman. He turned out to be fairly financially successful, having been born into relatively obscure poverty. The son of a renderer who didn't have a lot of money, apprenticed him to his brother who was a printer. And Franklin went into the printing business. Any questions on ethics? All right. I know I went through that a little fast. Let's talk about purchase behavior and communication. So consumer behavior is predicated on what we might call the rational actor model. And we have to distinguish between low-level rationality and higher-level rationality. Is it possible to pursue an irrational goal from a rational perspective? You can answer 1 to 5 points for the example. Is it possible to pursue an irrational goal from a rational perspective?
Yes.
How?
Like, it wouldn't be right for you to go get a certain medication that's illegal in Cont, that's legal in Colorado for your grandma.
Okay, that's a good example. It may be irrational to want to go get that medication because the law says that you shouldn't, but you can pursue that goal in a perfectly rational manner. What are you going to do? You're going to go fill up your car. You're going to drive to Colorado. You're going to go to one of the stores. You're going to buy it. You're going to come back. And if you're a law-abiding citizen, that may be irrational because the risks of getting caught are pretty great. Maybe in Oklahoma, particularly if you come back across the line, they tend to monitor cars from Colorado coming back and stop people, so you might get arrested. So that might be an irrational goal, but you can pursue it in a perfectly rational way. What would you do? Well, make sure that your car is in good working order. Make sure you have the funds, travel to Colorado, and come back. So yeah, you can pursue an irrational goal from a rational perspective. That's called low information rationality. You may have an irrational goal, like I want something that has nothing to do with, a good choice, but you can pursue that goal in a very rational method. So what does rational actor theory says? It says that people pursue goals, that they take steps to achieve these goals, and that it's based on our recognition of needs, which is talked about in the text in Maslow's hierarchy of needs. At the bottom are sort of physiological needs. And before you can move to the next levels, the needs at a lower level have to be met. So for example, your need for physiological things like food and shelter and water have to be met before you start thinking about things like safety. And if we know where people's needs are, if they're at the esteem or social level, we can market to them more effectively. So what happens is people recognize a need, you recognize you're hungry, you do the search, you do an internal search of things that you know. If it's more complex, you'll do a more advanced search, and you'll come up with a list of alternatives. You are hungry, so you know that the list of alternatives, if you want to stay on campus, is the food court. So we have the Flat Tire, we have Chick-fil-A, we have a pasta place over there, and there is what's the Subway place? It's not Subway, it's Quiznos, yeah, over there. And so you get this evaluation of alternatives. Well, I want to be healthy, so what am I going to eat? I'm going to avoid the Chick-fil-A. Quiznos has salad, so you're doing it with bread. And you then evaluate your alternatives, make a decision, and then you evaluate that decision after the fact. That salad was really awful. The lettuce was wilted. Their ranch dressing sucks. I'll never do that again. Right? Is that the way people really behave? Do we really think about these things? Well, there's a other model which says that that's not the way people behave. That we are irrational. We respond to stimuli in predictable but irrational ways. You're just hungry and you walk past the snack machine and you plunk in $1.50 and you get the payday to satisfy that need. No rational thought went into it. Marketers can predict and manipulate people in very predictable ways according to the irrational market or the irrational model by playing on these things that we know are true about people. Why is it, for example, that the candy bars are right up front at the cash register rather than in the back? Yeah, you're standing there, you're starving to death, you haven't had lunch, or you haven't had dinner, you're bought your groceries, and what do? You instantly pick up that candy bar. There's a reason this is called retail anthropology, that things are organized, and so we can take advantage of it. We got to think about that from an ethical perspective. Martin Lindstrom in biology talks about this, about how we can predict what people by their brain patterns. We put them in fMRI machines and we watch how they react to certain stimuli. So what's the synthesis model? Well, it depends on whether or not a purchase is high risk or low risk. For high risk purchases, we probably tend to be more rational. Things like buying a home. You're going to do more of a search. You're going to evaluate the alternatives. Do I buy new or previously used, previously owned home? If I buy new, what's the advantage? Well, I get to plan it out, do what I want, make it the way I want it. What's the advantage of buying a previously owned home? Well, I could probably move in a lot faster. It's not going to take 18 months, things like that. With regard to low risk things like eating lunch today, we have a tendency to be less rational. And so there's a synthesis that says that when it comes to high risk or high purchases like a car or a house, we tend to be more rational. And if it's lower risk, we tend to maybe not be as rational. So what influences our buying decisions? Well, psychological, perception is reality. One of the things that we know, for example, based on the research here, is that people perceive price as an indicator of quality. It's a heuristic for quality. Social influences. Why do you dress the way you dress? Your friends dress that way. Nobody can hear you shaking your head. You're not dressed like Lady Gaga. You have a tendency to dress, what's offered. Nobody comes up with their own style for the most part, except Lady Gaga or whoever else is new, the latest, trendsetter. You're influenced by your family and friends, school, peer groups, things like that. Organizational buying tends to be more rational as opposed to consumer behavior. And most of what we focus on in this class is going to be organizational buying. Why is that? Well, it's because demand is derived. What does that mean that demand is derived? Organizations don't buy things because they want them. They buy things because it allows them to support their customers or constituents. Why is it that we bought this computer for this classroom? It's not because I want the computer or anybody wants the computer at UCO for the computer's sake. We bought it so that I could give my lectures, so that we could satisfy our customer, which is you, the student. That makes it automatically more rational because it is derived. If I'm not satisfying your needs, I'm going to go out of business. And by the way, about 50%, it's estimated by Harvard that 50% of the schools, colleges, and universities in the United States will probably go out of business because they're not focusing on the needs of students necessarily. There are more decision makers, and that's going to make it more rational. It's more complex typically, and usually they are longer term relationships. So we have a tendency to, for example, here at UCO, when we buy something, we do a contract for a year for things like light bulbs. We don't just go down to Sam's and buy light bulbs. We do an RFP, we buy from a sole source for a year, whoever gets the bid on the contract. And so it's not like if you need a light bulb, which is what happens if you need a light bulb, well, you're probably going to go to the place that's most convenient to your house. If that's Sam's or Walmart, that's where you're going to buy the light bulb, because that's the place that's in your neighborhood. And if they go out of business or if you move, you're not going to stay going to Sam's or Walmart or Cash Saver or whatever. You're going to switch. How do we communicate with consumers? Well, this is the communication model. So we're going to send a source as businesses. We're going to be the source. We're going to encode a message. They're going to send that through a channel. In this class, what we focus on mostly is personal selling. And we'll talk about how to overcome these things like noise so that your receiver decodes it correctly and gets the message that you want. Now, what is noise? This is a big thing that we have to really think about with regard to particularly personal selling. People are distracted. You all are doing this. You're sitting there with your laptops. And I know you think you brought them so that you can take notes, but you're probably doing what? You're probably on Facebook, checking your email, looking at your Instagram. So I have to overcome those things which are noise in order to get my message across to you clearly. And then we look at the response and the feedback loop, and we can modify how we are selling. We can tell. One of the things that I do, for example, in selling you is I switch up my inflection. I walk around. I try to tell funny stories to get you to pay attention. I go off on little tangents. Tangents are actually really great ways of bringing you back because you all of a sudden switch your focus and then you're refocused on me and then I can make a point. So I'm constantly evaluating. So how messages are sent, the tone, inflection, all of those things become important. It's not just what you say, but it's how you say it. And I don't have time to show you the TED Talks, nonverbal. If you want, this is a good TED Talk. Amy Cuddy talks about how you can influence other people through your body language, which becomes enormously important, particularly in personal sales. So these PowerPoints are up on D2L. I would recommend that you look at the Cuddy video, think about that, think about the nonverbals that go into the communication, and how you can actually not only influence your consumer, but you can actually influence your behavior and how you're going to go about approaching people and selling. I did pass a roll sheet today, right? Yes. All right. If you didn't get it, come sign it. So next time, we'll have an exam over those first chapters through consumer behavior. We won't do chapter 5 on finding your selling style. That will be the second. On Tuesday, yeah. If you don't have a Scantron, I sell them for the department sells them for 50 cents.
Which one is it?
882E, the one with 50 questions per side. Yeah.